Today is the first video in a series that's going to be focused on world building, provided I make a bunch more videos about world building to, follow up on this one. To kick things off, we're going to be talking about depth versus complexity. This is something that applies not only to world building, but to all aspects of storytelling. Maybe I should have chosen a more world building specific topic for the first video in the series. Like a lot of my content, I've taken this idea from somebody else. Depth versus complexity is talked a lot about in the game design community, and I got the idea to do this video after reading a great article by Dan Felder about depth versus complexity that will be linked in the description below. A lot of the discussion that happens around depth versus complexity in the game design community also applies to writing, which is why this video exists. Broadly speaking, you can think of depth as the emergent decisions and interactions between different elements of your story. When you create an immersive world that a reader really gets absorbed in, then you've created a world with a lot of depth. When you create believable characters with layered backstories, a distinctive voice, and a compelling motivation, then you've created characters that have depth. When you create a plot where several elements interweave towards the end, allowing the protagonist to come to a creative and unexpected solution to their problem, you've created a plot with depth. Depth is a good thing. A story where the elements have depth is going to be more interesting to the reader. This is how you craft a rich narrative that is going to keep the readers around till the end. Now, in order to add depth to your story, you need to add complexity to your story. That's where things get difficult. You can think of complexity as the work the reader needs to do in order to understand and keep track of your story, or to experience the depth of your story. What you ultimately want to achieve is a story with as much depth as possible, while also limiting the amount of complexity that is generated in the story. You want the reader to experience the depth you've created, while also having to do as little work as possible. Complexity can be broken down into two broad categories. The first one is comprehension complexity. This is how much work the reader needs to do in order to understand how things work in your story. If your magic system requires the user to perform several differential equations in order to cast a spell, and it's very important that the reader understands how those equations work and the outcomes of them, that's going to create a lot of comprehension complexity. If your world involves complex greetings and elaborate social customs that all have different effects and meanings, then that's going to add a lot of comprehension complexity. You can also create comprehension complexity in the way that you write your prose. If you stray too far in the direction of purple prose, then you run the risk of making your writing incomprehensible. The reader is going to have to do extra work just to cut through and find the meaning of your prose. This will ultimately make it harder for the reader to understand what's going on. Comprehension complexity is going to make the story seem unsatisfying because the reader won't be able to understand the effects of different actions. Because they don't understand these effects, you can run into problems during the climax and resolution of the story because the reader doesn't fully grasp how things work. Closely related to comprehension complexity is tracking complexity. Tracking complexity is the amount of work the reader needs to do in order to keep track of all the elements of your story. This could be the current emotional state of the characters, the political situation in the kingdom, even the different positions and states of characters in a fight scene. Any story element that the reader needs to keep track of is going to create tracking complexity. If you think of your novel as a chess game, then tracking complexity involves remembering where all the pieces are on the board. Your readers are only going to be able to remember so many things as they move through the story. Each time you add a new character, a new religion, a new power, or a new subplot, you're adding tracking complexity to the story. So now that we've discussed the different kinds of complexity and their downfalls, how can you ensure that you reduce complexity while also ensuring that your story has enough depth to be interesting? Well, tune in next. No, I'm just kidding. We're going to talk about that right now. Tip number 1 is improve your writing. If you have tight, clear, effective prose, then you're going to be able to convey a lot more information to the reader, and they're going to have an easier time understanding it. Writing good physical descriptions, distinct dialogue, and narrative that flows well will make your story easier to understand for the reader. I obviously can't give you all that you need to know in order to improve your writing in this one video, but the information is out there, floating around in the ether. If you look around hard enough, you might find a YouTube channel that you can subscribe to get advice on how to improve your writing. I don't know, it could happen. So add reducing complexity to the long list of reasons you should be constantly seeking to improve your writing. Tip number 2, give information out slowly. I think one of the reasons that the info dump, wall of text, encyclopedia entries at the start of a story have fallen out of favor is because they add a lot of complexity. If your story involves 15 different countries, each with 5 different religions, who all worship 32 different gods, and you throw all of that information at the reader in one giant chunk, then you're going to create a lot of problems with both comprehension complexity and tracking complexity. Instead, focus on doling out pieces of information slowly over the course of the narrative as those things become relevant. It helps if you can do this through dialogue between characters or through the actions and beats of your story, rather than just dumping it all into the narration. By breaking information into smaller chunks, each of those chunks will be more easily understood by the reader, and it won't feel to the reader that they're getting a bunch of unnecessary information all at once. You can think of this like eating an elephant. Ensure it's cooked to a minimum internal temperature of 165 degrees and serve it with barbecue sauce. Well, how do people normally use that expression? That's not what that saying means. Tip number 3, go deep, not wide. A lot of times an author will try and add depth to their story by just adding more stuff to their story. This could be new characters, new world building elements, new magic systems. But if you do this, generally you're not actually going to be adding depth to the story, you're only going to be adding more complexity. Depth arises out of the detail and scope you give to each element of your story, not just the number of elements in your story. Instead of adding more to the story, try adding more detail to what you already have. Instead of adding a new character, maybe add a new subplot to an existing character. Instead of adding a new magic system, why not tighten up the rules of your existing systems? Instead of getting whacked in the head, why not consume a high sodium tomato-based beverage? Is that joke a little out of date? So remember that complexity is a necessary evil in any story. A story that completely lacks in complexity is not going to be interesting. Depth is what oftentimes makes a story interesting, and you can't create a story with depth without creating some complexity. What you need to do is create enough complexity to create the depth that you want, while at the same time not creating undue work and complexity for the reader. I hope the tips in this video will help you do that. If you want to see more content like this, you can check out all my other writing advice videos and subscribe to my channel. I post new writing advice videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.